you about Al-Hol camp, which you've probably heard referenced in a couple of the speeches today. We've made passing reference to the camp, and so if you were to actually Google Al-Hol camp, you would see something like this. A sprawling internally displaced persons camp, which holds about 40,000 people. You can see images of how the camp is generally quite often litter-ridden, potentially not necessarily with good humanitarian conditions. Particularly at the moment, you will see pictures of children struggling with the impacts of severe weather and climate change as we go into the winter. You'll probably also recognize some of the living conditions, the very well-known blue logos. But perhaps most important for the panel today is the iconic images of Al-Hol's camp residents, who quite often are dressed from head to toe in black and can often be seen raising one finger into the sky. Now, many of us here in the room know that this is a very common Islamic gesture which represents the oneness of God. But unfortunately, in Al-Hol, this is something that has been co-opted to signal ongoing support for Daesh. You'll also see readily available images of these women's children who are spending some of their earliest developmental years growing up behind barbed wire. However, what you probably see far less of is... I have to be closer to the mic, apparently. Is this fine? Okay. What you will see far less of are children raising one finger into the sky so that they can answer questions from a teacher, of using a whiteboard to learn basic numeracy skills, or the Al-Hol camp's youngest children excited to engage in team-building games. However, this is the dichotomy for about 20,000 children who do still live in Al-Hol camp today, and who, like many millions of children around the world, should have gone back to school last month. What I'd like to talk to you about today are some of the challenges that these children might face in the next 10 years, how some of the gaps in education might present barriers to them being resilient enough to deal with some of these difficult situations that they have faced in their earliest developmental years, and hopefully to show you how creative, communications-driven approaches to education could provide practical solutions to tackling some of these gaps. So, as I said, my name is Rebecca. I work for IN2. We are a research and communications firm which specializes in rapidly changing environments. A lot of our work focuses on the intersection between conflict, displacement, and reintegration, and so, of course, we spend a lot of time considering the fate of the people of Al-Hol camp. We also work closely with a variety of implementing partners to conduct regular research and to look at how that research can inform programming interventions. Our research is included but not limited to atmospheric reporting, semi-structured interviews, and focus group discussions. So we've heard a couple of different references to Al-Hol today, and for those of you who don't know the camp very well, there are three major populations inside Al-Hol camp. The foreign nationals that Emma was referring to, who are quite often rehabilitated and repatriated back to Europe and elsewhere. The groups of Iraqis who Joanna's work elsewhere has focused on, who often are repatriated through a dedicated rehabilitation center in northern Iraq. But one question often remains outstanding when we talk about Al-Hol, and that is what will happen to the some 15,000 Syrians who are still living in the camp today, and for whom repatriation is not really an option. About half of those Syrians are children under 17, and if you look back at efforts to release them from the camp since 2020, these have taken place, but they have been particularly slow, quite sporadic, and they only really focus on areas that are elsewhere in northeast Syria. So our research has shown that about 80% of the Syrians who are left in Al-Hol today actually originate from areas that they can't return to, which means that rehabilitation centers, return pathways, reintegration efforts are not really an option for this population. And this led us to ask ourselves the question, what impact might this have on Al-Hol for the next 5 to 10 years? And we created the model that you can see, hopefully, behind the screen. So we, as part of our research, collect regular population and demographic data about the camp. This is broken down by age, nationality, and sex. And what we did was, by taking the average population change month on month throughout the past few years of Al-Hol, and looking at the way that children are transitioning into older age groups and eventually into adulthood, we were able to create the model that's in front of you. Now, the two most interesting parts for this discussion are the bottom blue band, which represents the Syrian men, and the band above it in pale yellow, which represents Syrian women. So if you to look at the gap between 2024 and 2026, you can see that there's a very steady increase in the number of adults of these two population groups. If you cast your eyes forwards from 2026 up until 2030, the pace of this actually increases. So we expect to see an increasing number of Syrian men and women inside Al-Hol camp within the next 10 years. This is mostly driven by the thousands of children who are at present aged 8 to 12 and are living inside the camp. But as I said, due to the lack of release methods, are just growing up inside the camp and don't have any prospects of going anywhere. You'll also see in the bottom right-hand corner that we have used aged 14 as a marker of adulthood. Now, I know that this is not conventional, but we have done this for some very specific reasons around the socio-cultural and economic challenges that children of this age would face inside the camp. And I will go into this in a little bit more detail later on. But it's really important to remember this age group of pre and post 14 years old, because many of the children that we're speaking about today face adult-like challenges that are not suitable for their developmental age. So all of this means that in the next 1 to 2 years, we could be looking at a situation where Al-Hol is no longer a majority children's camp, but rather that we're having significant populations of both adult men and adult women inside the space. We believe that this will have significant impact on the provision of food aid and shelter. We also believe it will have significant impact on the need for sexual and reproductive health services, as we assume that many of these young women will go on to become new mothers, and also raise questions around sustainable livelihoods inside the camp, as many of the young men will be called upon to provide for their wives and their children as they build a life inside Al-Hol. So you might ask, why is this relevant to a panel about children and terrorism? But the reason that we believe it's so important is that the future adults of Al-Hol are actually the children today who should have gone back to school, but for many of whom that wasn't really a possibility. These are the same children who have really significant psychosocial challenges, a number of developmental factors that have really made their early years difficult, whether that's experiences of conflict, violence, repeated displacement, exposure to VA ideology, and in the context of Al-Hol camp itself, some very difficult living conditions as well. We know that these are all key markers of vulnerability, but for us it's really a question of standing at this crossroads between a threat and an opportunity, depending on how we intervene today, rather than waiting until they become adults tomorrow. So we heard a lot in the previous panel about how education is often the best route into speaking to children, and how their attendance at school is really vital in preventing some of these developments into radicalization, or in the case of some of these children, re-radicalization given their family background. But I'd like to ask you, what happens when the barriers to actually attending school are so difficult that children might not be in school at all? When I speak about the education landscape in Al-Hol, we're usually referring to donor-funded schools that are run through NGOs. We believe there's about 20 schools in Al-Hol of this nature. And when you look at children of kindergarten age, a solid majority do attend. They mostly take part in activities that are designed to be psychosocial support, and this is often done through play therapy. For children who are aged 6 to 12, there is basic literacy and numeracy on offer, but when a lot of our research shows that the curriculum is not necessarily rigorous enough for them to get a solid education that would be expected for this primary school age. As we progress into the older ages, we see that the likelihood that children continue to attend school actually reduces. So by girls aged 12 to 17, about 36% do not attend school. This increases more if you look at boys of the same age, so we're looking at about 39% of boys in Al-Hol who do not attend school. The barriers for teenagers to attend school is therefore really high, and our research broke this down into 3 different types of barriers: the cognitive, the material, and the physical. When we look at the cognitive, actually we find that a lot of residents in Al-Hol do really value education. They see it as something that is super important, something that they themselves had disrupted, and that they felt that this did not set them up well for their life. So they always wish for something different for their children. However, the same caregivers also say that the schools in Al-Hol are not necessarily rigorous enough, that they tend to prioritize play over learning, and especially for the older children, that 3 hours a day, which is what's on offer in schools in Al-Hol, is not necessarily enough to foster that love of learning and the in-depth level of learning. When we come to the material, we also see that a lot of residents are living in extreme economic precarity, and this forces many of them to send children as young as 9 out to work. If I read one quote to you from a Syrian woman who's 22 years old, she says, "When I go to the camp market, I see lots of children working from 8 till 2 for 5,000 lira. Now, for reference, that's about 30 cents. If the parents were not in need, they wouldn't send their children to work." Finally, parents also cite arrays of security challenges around actually accessing and getting to school, not least of which is the verbal and sometimes physical abuse by people who continue to support Daesh, but who say that the parents should not be sending their children to Western infidel schools that are on offer inside the camp. So what I'd like to suggest to you today in my final minutes is how we can ease some of these obstacles, both as researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. On the screen, you can see a 3-part approach, which really tries to supplement and not replace formal education. And we believe that through creative and communications-led interventions, we can really look at some of these target areas that you can see in the yellow and in the red. Lots of the residents in our whole camp really preference a blend of formal education and homeschooling. They always use the Arabic language saying, which says that one hand does not clap. You need formal schooling supplemented by home learning in order to create a holistic environment. One of the creative ways that we have been able to address such challenges, for example, is by using radio and messaging apps to provide literacy and numeracy classes for young children. This provides guided learning for people inside of their tents. It gives them homework that they can complete and then send back into messaging applications in order to get some feedback. We found that this is practical and engaging. It also allows caregivers and children to bond over their education. And in some cases where the older generation in fact had disrupted education, they can then learn alongside one another, and we're creating space for intergenerational learning. We also try to blend religious education into this space. So we use a lot of Quranic verses and Islamic history and stories from the Prophet to provide a really common and safe vehicle for people to learn new ideas. We find that this works very well with the population in the camp, given their own preferences for Islam and sometimes conservative social values. As we know that Daesh has quite often tried to step into this space between homeschooling and religious education to indoctrinate young children, we feel that reclaiming the space for a learning that is led by Islamic teachings is also really important. Finally, because I think I'm almost out of time, I would just like to say that we would advocate for expanding this model into older populations as well. We feel that by expanding it into adolescents in particular, many of whom need to learn skills like vocational training, for example, life skills like budgeting, and have probably had a lot of their education disrupted over the last 10 years. We believe that this could create a space for really reaching those hard-to-reach teenagers that are on the cusp of becoming adults and don't necessarily have the skills to deal with those challenges. This would allow them to balance their working responsibilities, it would empower them to choose when and where they learn, and it would hopefully increase the reach to this growing population inside the camp. So what I'm calling for is that we reconsider how we distribute donor funding. I'm not suggesting that we should replace schools. They absolutely have a fair place in the camp, but just to say that much more needs to be done and should and could be done to supplement that learning in home and religious spaces as well.
Great. Thank you very much.